Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good Tuesday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 25th of August. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date on your local weather information. No matter what part of Alaska you're in, there's a way to get weather where you are. You can do that online at weather.gov/Alaska. You can listen to Marine VHF or NOAA Weather Radio. You can call us on the weather info line 800-472-0391, and many of you probably know the local number to your weather forecast office, so you can get really important information when you need it and make better decisions that way. We welcome that as well. Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, all ways to get information in between the Alaska weather shows. NWS Alaska, as of last check, was showing information about heavy rains and wind around north and western parts of the Alaska coastline. You can find us on Twitter using the AKwx hashtag, and of course on YouTube you'll get your daily afternoon map briefing that shows up on your computer around 4 o'clock or so. Here's what we're talking about today. As far as hazardous weather goes, it's wind and waves and rainfall. The rain is where we see this orange shaded color here, a flash flood watch, or a flood watch I should say, for the interior of the Seward Peninsula. We've seen, as of earlier this morning, about ½ inch to 1½ inches of rainfall already, and there's plenty more to come. The core of the storm will be working over in the next 24 to 36 hours, and several more inches of rain are possible in some cases there. On top of that, we've got a lot of wind moving through on a south and westerly direction, and that's going to bring up the waves to about 6 to 8 feet in many cases around the Norton Sound communities, maybe 5 to 7 a little bit further north up toward Kivalina. And the waves probably as high as 10 to 12 feet around the north and western coast. And that means surge on the north and western coast could be about 1 to 2 feet above normal astronomical high tides. And you're talking about a 2 to 4 foot surge around areas in Norton Sound and around the northwestern Kotzebue coast. So not only is it rain, and there will be plenty of that for our friends up and down the western coastline, but there will be that south and westerly flow that is going to bring up the winds and the waves and the surge again over the next 24 to 36 hours. In some cases, the high surf advisory will continue until Thursday morning. So if you're in any community along the western coast, good idea to be paying attention to the weather now. And if you need more information, please call. We're happy to help you understand what we're talking about and what we're seeing so you can make a better decision. Here's a look at the Bering Sea, and you can see plenty of cloud cover streaming off of remnants of what used to be Typhoon Atsani. That was out across the western Pacific. As this continues to drive northward, we won't get the main core of the storm. That looks like it's going to stay well off to the west, but the moisture is surely streaming into south and western Alaska right now and into interior Alaska. As it does that, it has copious moisture with it, and all that is simply being wrung out just like you had a towel and you're squeezing that out. It would be pretty torrential if you're underneath. In this case, the tropical moisture is being wrung out over Alaska, and it's going to be fairly wet. As we go ahead for the next 24 to 36 hours, this could present us with some localized heavy rainfall across south and western Alaska, as well as the Seward Peninsula, as we saw with a flood watch there, as well as the Brooks Range. And as freezing levels come down, that could mean a possibility for some fresh snow across some of the higher terrain in the Brooks Range and periods of heavier rainfall across the interior and maybe even south central Alaska briefly as the weather system comes through. Here's a look at the visible satellite picture, and for now, once again, southeast enjoying some drier weather before the bulk of this precipitation and fire hose starts pointing your direction. In the meantime, cloud cover covering up the interior and the west. You can see these ripply, kind of bumpy patterns here. That's indicative of a lot of rising air. And when we get into these weather situations, it's not uncommon for a large amount of that area to be lifted upward in great mass. And as that happens, we wring out a lot of rain all at once. So a very broad area of rainfall expecting to develop here across south and west, all the way out across the Bering Sea, especially as that warm and wet air is lifted over the higher terrain of western and northwestern Alaska. So things are fairly quiet across the Gulf right now. As we go through tonight, though, and as the weather system moves from west to east, you'll notice winds coming up across the Bering Sea, and gales are expected across most of the Bering and north of the Aleutians into the Bering Strait as we head into tonight and tomorrow. So again, mariners, watch the weather carefully as well going forward. Today's weather shows that frontal boundary across eastern Asia. It's just west of the Bering Strait, but sliding eastward now. High pressure is losing its grip across the Gulf of Alaska, although it is a pretty decent grip at the moment. 1,034 millibars, nothing to shake off just so easily. Low pressure south and west of Haida Gwaii at 1,011 millibars, and you can see it's on the ragged, drier edge of just blowing a few clouds into southeastern Alaska. Periods of rain will continue to move in from west and southwest, and it looks like that will also work its way in across the northern coast. Remember, this is a west and southwesterly flow that will be picking up tonight and tomorrow, so high surf advisories are in effect for areas generally north of the Yukon Delta all the way up toward Point Barrow. A frontal boundary will work into the Chukchi seacoast as we head into tonight and tomorrow, and several waves of low pressure are located along this leading edge of that new air mass. The drier and cooler air mass is behind it, and the wetter air mass from the Pacific is out in front of it. So that means rain is a pretty good bet for most of the Yukon Valley as well as points north. Some of that will be heavier around the Seward Peninsula and the Kobuk and Noatak valleys. The chance for snowfall across the Brooks Range is certainly there. That will probably come in a little bit better and stronger behind this weather system, but higher terrain could certainly see some light snow as we go ahead into Wednesday and Thursday. You can see that cooler air starting to rush in from the north and west as we get into Wednesday, as that leading edge of that line here comes in from the west to southeast. High pressure sitting south of Dutch Harbor on Alaska and Nikolsky, 1,034 millibars, is not giving up easily. It's pushing drier air into southeastern Alaska, but you can see that rain is dropping in from the north and from the west, and that could bring some periods of rainfall to Anchorage and the Kenai Mountains from the west to the east, which is a little different sometimes. Usually we get a big slosh over from Prince William Sound. You'll notice there's another boundary sitting out here across the south and western Bering. That's going to keep showers across the central and western chain and keep some of that moisture focused right across the Bering Sea. Clouds will continue to fill into southeastern Alaska by Wednesday night and into Thursday. There's a much better chance of seeing some moderate to occasionally heavy rainfall, with the heavier rainfall probably on the northern parts of the coast as it usually is. Rain will linger around in the morning around the Anchorage Bowl and the Kenai Mountains up toward the Talkeetnas, but the bulk of the focus for rainfall will continue shifting eastward with the entire weather system here. Behind that, showers will continue. There will probably be some higher terrain snowfall up around the Brooks Range and maybe even the Alaska Range as well. Out across the west, look for another surge of warmer and wetter air for the western chain. 1,036 millibar high now, which is stronger than it was the previous day. Still sitting just south of the chain, so there is a return flow coming in that will be stronger on the western side, but you can see the cooler and drier air certainly dropping in behind that as well. Here's a look at temperatures today. Not a bad day at all in southeast. If you're in Juneau, temperatures just about tapped 70 degrees. It probably was 70 for a few folks in town. 66 in Sitka, just shy of 70 around Ketchikan, Annette, Craig, and Klawock. Hyder was 66. Looks like Cordova made it up to 64 by 3 o'clock. 63 around Valdez. Lower to mid 60s up and down Cook Inlet. 66 in Anchorage and lower 60s around the Susitna Valley. Beautiful day there. 63 as you head up toward Gulkana and Glen Allen. If you're going out to do any hunting in the next couple of weeks, certainly if your trip starts tonight or tomorrow in South Central, you'll certainly want to take the rain gear with you. It is not going to be terribly dry in the coming days. 51 today up around Fairbanks, 63 for Eagle, and 61 in Northway with Denali showing 56. Port Yukon saw temperatures around 57. It was 46 around the Anaktuvuk Pass region, lower to mid 50s for most of the Arctic coast, and staying fairly mild thanks to that warm and wet southwesterly flow. 43 in Kaktovik, out across Point Hope and Point Lay, temps were in the mid 40s. Kotzebue Sound temperatures were in the lower to mid 50s there for Kivalina at 51, Kotzebue 54. 50 around Nome today with Norton Sound temperatures in the upper 50s. Galena was showing 58, about 56 in McGrath with Grayling at 54, 53 degrees around Bethel earlier today. Bristol Bay temperatures were in the lower 50s with the Alaska Peninsula in the mid-50s to mid-60s, considerably warmer around Sand Point, and lower 50s for St. Paul and St. George with just shy of 60 around Unalaska and Dutch Harbor. And it made it up to 63 degrees in Adak today. It must have felt like the middle of summer for you. Hope you enjoyed that. Here's a look at temperatures overnight tonight, and you'll notice most areas in the interior, the Yukon and Kuskokwim valleys, and certainly the west coast, and certainly the Arctic coast for that matter. Wouldn't want to leave you out. Temps are in the upper 40s to even mid-50s. It is going to be pretty warm tonight, thanks to clouds, thanks to the wind blowing in that very wet air. 50 in Nome, mid-40s for southeast, lower 50s for the Alaska Peninsula, 51 in St. George and in Kodiak tonight. High temperatures tomorrow will stay close to 60 degrees for many along the Yukon and Tanana Valley. Mid to upper 50s around Bethel, 53 in Nome, 45 in Barrow. Fairbanks looking at about 60 degrees, lower 60s for south central with more clouds, 65 in Kodiak, mid 60s for southeast, and some folks might just nose up on that 70-degree mark if you're around Ketchikan, Craig, Klawock. Looks like a pretty nice day for you. Enjoy that. Look for IFR conditions all the way, though, from Barrow into the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range. The southwest-facing slopes around the Seward Peninsula have a much better chance of seeing some pretty heavy rainfall. The lower Yukon and Kuskokwim valleys will be looking at IFR, as well as most of the western coast, all the way out toward the western Aleutians. And east of that, MBFR conditions should be expected. Anaktuvuk and Adigan Pass are expecting IFR conditions for your Wednesday. We'll see that transition to IFR for Lake Clark and Merrill Pass. And for Rainy Pass, we expect instrument flight rule. Windy Pass probably hovering around MBFR, as is Isabel Pass throughout the daytime tomorrow. Montana Pass right now looks to be VFR. That change will come for you about a day later. Tanita Pass, we expect MBFR conditions to develop during your day. Portage Pass, we'll see MBFR. And Chilkoot and White Pass, we expect to see visual flight rule throughout your day. Freezing levels show that colder air is starting to move, and you can see levels from 2, 4, and even 6,000 feet just west of the Bering Strait. But for now, most of interior Alaska and south and western Alaska looking at levels between 8 and about 12,000 feet. Southeastern Alaska is looking at levels between 8 and 10,000 feet. Icing potential will be growing and hovering over the northern parts of Alaska for the next day or so. Above 10,000 feet for now, though, is where you'll run into my apologies, this should be occasional widespread moderate, not the isolated severe. We're talking about occasional moderate here, and the same goes for south and western Alaska. Tomorrow's jet stream shows low pressure across the central and eastern Pacific. Wind speeds between 75 and 80 knots. A stronger westerly flow pushing all of that moisture right into western Alaska. So it's as easy as it gets. Pacific moisture travels up the weather superhighway and slams it right into western Alaska and meets up with cold air that you see in that northern dip here across the Bering Strait and Chukchi Sea. At 9,000 feet, we're dealing with westerlies as strong as 50 to 60 knots. So we'll see those winds continue eastward into northern and central parts of southeast with high pressures south of Unalaska and Dutch Harbor. That's bringing in south and westerly winds for the central and western chain. And we still have a little bit of a counterclockwise flow here thanks to low pressure well south of Haida Gwaii. So that's just kind of clipping the Dixon entrance area with northwesterlies up around the Chukchi Sea coast at 50 knots. They're a little slower at 3,000 feet there, as slow as 30 to 40 knots, so not terribly slow. There will be some chop up and down the western coast as a result. Wind speeds up to 40 to 50 knots across the southern Bering Sea and the Yukon and Kuskokwim Delta at 50 knots. So it is going to be a bumpy ride across the YK Delta, Norton Sound, and all the way up to the Brooks Range and probably up to the Arctic coast tomorrow, thanks to some of the faster moving winds. We also have some faster moving winds right across Prince William Sound coming in from the south and west at around 40 knots. Wind speeds a little bit slower across southeastern Alaska here at 3,000 feet. So turbulence we're really going to focus on, and I got the colors right this time, we're really going to focus on the lower to middle Yukon Valley below 6,000 feet and across southwestern Alaska below 4,000 feet. The gaps probably not having much of an issue just yet. That'll develop as we get into the latter part of the week. And many areas up and down the western coast below 6,000 feet will at least have some light to isolated moderate. So it's a developing situation, and if you haven't flown today and you want to fly tomorrow, check the weather situation out very carefully just to make sure you can get home. Conditions will be worsening from west to east really for the rest of the week. That's a look at your aviation forecast. I'll be back in just a few minutes with the rest of your weather for the marine areas. Stay tuned.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jessica Cherry.
And I'm Forrest Kirst, a commercial pilot.
And today we're going to talk about an experiment we're doing using a small aircraft where we've mounted a sensor package to the aircraft to measure temperature, humidity, and pressure, as well as elevation and longitude and latitude of the airplane. And with the package, we're going to sample the local winter inversion here in Fairbanks, Alaska. And an inversion is where you have the surface atmosphere that's closest to the land is colder than the atmosphere above it, which is the opposite of normal conditions throughout the year throughout North America. Forrest, maybe you could tell us more about how a pilot experiences an inversion during the wintertime.
On the ground during our pre-flight, it's very cold out this morning. It's minus 28 centigrade, which is about minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. So doing our pre-flight, it's extremely cold, hard on the airplane, hard on the people. For flying at the colder temperatures for doing these experiments, we're somewhere between minus 20 and minus 40 degrees. So we have to dress for that temperature inside the airplane as well as when we're outside of the airplane. When we're doing our pre-flight, we have to be extremely careful not to damage the plastic parts on the outside of the airplane. Extremely careful not to touch the metal parts with our fingers because we'll get contact frostbite. And we have to be real careful just with everything because it's just so cold. We have to dress as if we're going to be outdoors the whole time, and we use the aircraft heater to make it comfortable in our clothes and so we can see out the window. When we get the airplane running and we do our takeoff roll, we have increased engine performance and increased lift because of the colder, denser air. So we get off the ground earlier and have a better climb rate. When we reach the inversion layer, quite often the windows will fog up. The airplane's performance will decrease slightly because it's warmer air, produces less lift, and it produces less power from the engine.
When an inversion is present, air doesn't move anywhere, especially it doesn't want to move up. And so the classic look there is the steam out of the power plant or automobile exhaust, any kind of wood smoke or such, will come out of a chimney and then just flatten out and not move up. And if it moves horizontally at all, it's very slow, just creeping along. When you see that kind of lack of air movement, especially when there's clear skies, the sun is maybe low on the horizon, that is an inversion day in interior Alaska.
The reason it is so cool in the far north during winter is that the incoming radiation is at such a low angle. Now, as the atmosphere begins to cool in late fall, we start to get snowfall, which causes the land surface to be white, and light colors reflect incoming radiation right back, which causes additional cooling. And it's the reason we have a persistent inversion from late fall through early spring here in Fairbanks.
To get a radiation inversion to form, you need clear or mostly clear skies. You need no wind or very little wind down at the surface. And you need to have the sun under the horizon or high noon in December such that even if the sun is up, it's so low it doesn't really feed in any energy. When those three things happen, you lose heat to space from the surface of the Earth, but you're not getting any new heat in. And you get a very cold layer of air hugging the ground, cold, dense air that just lays down in the bottom of the valley. That's the classic radiation inversion setup.
So as we do our experiment with the aircraft, we're going to use a similar instrumentation package as is mounted on the standard weather balloons. We're going to measure temperature profiles, relative humidity, and pressure. And we're also going to tie the sensor package into a GPS unit, a global positioning system unit, so we know where the aircraft is located relative to the topography. So now I want to tell you about the instrument package that we're using on the aircraft. First of all, we use a NiCad 12-volt battery to power the data logger and the instruments. The data logger records the output from the meteorological sensors, which here include a temperature and relative humidity sensor and a pressure transmitter, which works like a barometer to measure atmospheric pressure. This particular one is going to plug into the static port in the aircraft, which also helps power some of the aircraft instruments. Finally, we have the Global Positioning System computer, which measures the latitude, longitude, and altitude of the aircraft. This one has an accuracy of about 10 meters, which is perfectly fine for what we're trying to do here. Here's a picture of our temperature and relative humidity sensor installed on the aircraft. So this is an FAA-approved plate here mounted to the window. And we want the temperature sensor mounted towards the aft of the aircraft so we don't get air rushing in and it has a chance to equilibrate to the environmental conditions. And then finally, our pressure sensor is connected to this static port in the airplane, which again just measures the ambient pressure of the atmosphere where it hits this little hole in the plane. That's piped back into our pressure sensor inside. So one of the things that we're going to go out and do today is that we're going to attach the sensor package to the aircraft, and then Forrest is going to take off from Fairbanks International.
To get repeatability for the data, we flew in and out of Fairbanks International, Nenana Airport, Ladd Army Airfield, and Eielson Airfield. So we do a very slow climb up through the inversion layer, climbing at about 100 feet per minute. Just very slow climb to the top of the inversion, find out where the ceiling is, and then once we're at the ceiling of the inversion, we do very slow porpoising up and down through the inversion to see if it's stable, if it's got different characteristics throughout it. Then we get to the next airport and we do a very slow descent into the airport at about 100 feet per minute, all the way to the ground.
Always learning a little something more when I watch that show. Here's a look at the sea ice edge, and as we understand it, some barge traffic having trouble around the areas east of Prudhoe Bay toward Kaktovik, kind of getting choked off a little bit here because some of the ice is a little bit hard to transit across some of the more northern points there between Kaktovik and Prudhoe Bay. You can get the very latest sea ice edge anytime you like by going to weather.gov/Anchorage/ice, and it's going to look a little different when you get there, but you can make your own map the way you like. The quilt colored shapes on there will indicate the thickness of the ice, and you can always take a look at the 5-day forecast and see how things are expected to change in the very near future there. So again, this type of image available to you online anytime you like at weather.gov. Here's a look at the winds over southeast. Things are fairly nice right now, and as you saw, temperatures were pretty warm. They'll have another warm day in southeast tomorrow with wind speeds only around 10 to 15 knots in all areas. The outer coast looking at seas from 3 to 4 feet. On the inside, 2-foot seas there with 10-knot winds from the south and north. Thursday's marine weather starts to change a little bit, especially in the north. With winds coming in from the west and southwest, you'll see 6-foot seas developing. Across the inner coastline, look for 15 to 20-knot winds, generally from the south and southeast. 4-foot seas developing around the Lynn Canal and points southward. Outside the Dixon entrance, you're looking at 6-foot seas with a southwesterly flow. For south central, a south and westerly wind, the predominant pattern there for the north and western Gulf. Inside Cook Inlet, 20 to 30 knots. Winds are coming up quickly thanks to low pressure making it into the northern and western interior. Look for 7 to 8-foot seas all the way down to the western Barrens with 5-foot seas there. Shelikof Strait, 6-foot seas. And winds continue to come up in the western Gulf. East of the Barren Islands, you're looking at 40-knot winds with 12-foot seas and 15 to 20-knot winds inside and outside of Prince William Sound. 4 to as high as 12-foot seas west of the Barrens there as we get into Thursday. For the Alaska Peninsula, southwesterlies inside of Bristol Bay and down the coast, you're looking at 10-foot seas there with a 30-knot wind. And westerlies on the Pacific coast, 20 to 25 knots. By Wednesday, expect winds to come up a little bit more. From Castle Cape to Chignik, you're looking at westerlies from 30 knots with 9-foot seas, and northwesterlies inside of Bristol Bay. It's going to be a blustery day there with an 8-foot sea and 30-knot winds, 9-foot seas down the coast toward Cold Bay and False Pass. For the Aleutians, look for a south and westerly wind for the central and eastern chain on Wednesday, 20 to 25 knots with 7 to 9-foot seas on the Bering Sea coast, 8 to 10-foot seas on the Pacific coast. From Adak westward, look for 11 to 13-foot seas with 15 to 25 knots on the south and southeasterly wind. That comes up even more on Thursday to 30 knots. With the south and westerly wind holding around 15 to 20 knots on Thursday, conditions should improve just a little bit more. 5 to 6-foot seas on the Bering Sea coast and 8 to 10-foot seas on the Pacific coast as we go through Thursday afternoon. The west coast, a predominant southwesterly flow, of course, is what we were talking about, bringing the high surf advisory to many of our communities north of Hooper Bay into Norton Sound and the Seward Peninsula, Kotzebue Sound, all the way up toward Point Barrow. In some cases, that could bring a surge of 2 to 4 feet at its worst. with 6 to 8 foot waves breaking on many coastal areas there, 10 to 12 foot waves around the northern Arctic coast. The southwesterlies will continue as we get into Thursday, and then by Thursday afternoon we expect a west and northwesterly shift to take shape, 20 to 35 knots in the northern Bering and 20 knots in the southern Bering of the Kuskokwim Bay, as well as the Pribilofs with an 8-foot sea there. Across the northern coast, south and westerly winds will continue for Wednesday, 25 knots on the northern coast with westerlies across the Beaufort Sea coast, 4-foot seas expected there. And as we get into Thursday, a broad westerly flow sweeping across the north from 30 to 35 knots, seas as high as 13 to 14 feet from Barrow down toward Point Lay. And outside of Kotzebue Sound, you're looking at 30 knots with a 7-foot sea. The reason all that's happening is the next weather maker is moving ashore as we head into tonight, and that also brings us to a reminder about a flood watch across the Seward Peninsula. The interior of the Seward Peninsula, very close to the track of the low pressure system, is where we expect some of the heavier rainfall, especially on southwest facing slopes. We've already had a ½ inch to 1.5 inches of rain there, and more rain is expected over the next 24 to 36 hours. On top of that, south and westerly winds will continue to push water toward the western coastline and the northwestern coast, all the way up toward Point Barrow. And in those cases, again, high surf is likely as we go through tonight and tomorrow. So if your community is one of those places that suffers on a southwesterly flow, now is a good time to think about what you need to be doing in case the water is coming up, and we've heard that it is coming up in a few places. Westerlies are coming across the northwestern parts of the state, and that means rainy weather to come for the next couple days. That's your Alaska weather. Good night.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.